recording button. There we go. And take it away, Laura. And thank you, Laura, for doing this. I know it's a lot of work.
All right. Thank you, Doug. And yeah, I'm going to have to talk real fast this time since I'm splitting the time with Brad Rippey today. Picture you see here on the front, tractor fire from earlier this month down in southern South Dakota near Mitchell. I believe those folks had that tractor on the farm all of about 20 days before it caught fire. And I hear this is a story that is common across the region recently with several harvest fires and other grass or field fires because of the very dry conditions, which is certainly one of the themes going on the last month here across the north central region. A little bit about some of our partners here. Our next webinar is actually November 17th. Sorry, I neglected to add that date incorrectly. November 17th, same time here at 1 o'clock Central. And those are a lot of our partners, state climatologists and other drought centers around the region and the national centers. And you can access the recorded presentations as well at our partners at Midwest and High Plains Regional Climate Centers. So today we're going to start with kind of recent conditions over the last 30 days or so and 30 to 45 days, talking about some impacts we've seen and heard across the region, and then I'll get into the outlook. So kind of starting current time, moving forward in time. And of course, we have our favorite little insects at this time of year, the woolly bears, courtesy of our friend Aaron Wilson at The Ohio State University. First of all, starting with just the month of September overall, temperature generally above average in the northern or western part of our north central region here, or central region of the Weather Service. Generally closer to average there in the gray shaded area, so from Missouri to Ohio and south of that area. See we have about 128 years of records. So, looking at Wyoming, even second warmest September on record, Montana third warmest September on record. So even if they're not red, they're really much warmer than typical and near record for this time of year. Looking at the growing season overall, as Brad will be talking about, more the agriculture side and growing season for 2022. So this is looking at the last 6 months, April through September. And again, looking at temperatures generally closer towards normal for the season, for the 6-month season, North Dakota, Minnesota, Wisconsin, Iowa, and Illinois. But outside of that, generally warmer than average for the season overall. Although looking back towards the earlier parts, say the first 3 months of that time, we did have cooler conditions in the north. And then the second or latter part of the season turned warm. So it wasn't evenly distributed, of course, across the region over that time frame. Precipitation here, again, looking at just the month of September and how we rank in 128 years of record, we see really dry conditions there in the beige and orange colors. With the lighter beige colors are the bottom third. Driest of September's on record. And you see the numbers on the rankings there with a couple states, South Dakota and Missouri in our region, 10th driest for September, for the month of September. Although we look at further west, Wyoming, for example, was a beneficiary in parts of Colorado of the very active monsoon season in the Southwest, and ended up with a little more moisture and a smidge on the green side there with 89th 89th driest, if that makes sense, closer to the upper third wetter part of their history and for the month of September. Growing season overall, again, looking at the 6-month period for April through September, you see a real mixed bag of wetter, drier, and near normal conditions. So near normal is in the gray color, anyone on the drier side in the beige to orange, and anyone on the wetter side in the green colors or teal colors. North Dakota, remember, had a wetter earlier part of the season, and that filtered into neighboring parts of Minnesota and South Dakota, but then turned dry. And you see that dryness with Nebraska kind of winning the race at 10th driest of the states in the region here that we cover on this webinar for the growing season overall. October for temperature, so looking at how different we've been from normal or average temperature. This is for the month of October. After those maps that I just showed you, showing cooler than average temperatures there in the eastern part of our region, warmer than average in the west northwest part of the region, and so kind of a split there from west to east as far as who's been warmer or cooler compared to average just for the last 19 days. But you can look at the differences here between the maximum temperatures on the left and the minimum temperatures on the right, and how different they've been from average, really just here for the month of October, where we've seen some cooler temperatures come across the area. You see, first of all, on the left, maximum temperature, generally holding that warmer in the west, cooler in the east, but really what sticks out are the minimum temperatures on the right-hand map, where really from Iowa down to Kentucky, temperatures really much colder than average, 6 to 8 to 10 degrees below average for the first 19 days of October. So really the minimum temperatures are really driving the average down on that cooler side. Precipitation for October for the month so far, no big surprise here, much drier. And I'll show the percent of normal on the next graph, or the next map. But precipitation, this is total precipitation for the first 19 days of October. And you see a lot of reds there, which are less than a half an inch. Even in the dark maroon colors, less than a tenth of an inch. And you see that scattered all across the region. There isn't really one area that's really particularly drier than the other, except for parts of those areas that are downwind of the Great Lakes, as you see in the kind of the green areas there near Lake Superior and Lake Michigan. So looking at percent of normal. So normal here would be somewhere between the yellow and green color. So you see some locally heavy areas over Montana, some areas of Montana, and I said a couple areas there near the Great Lakes or downwind of the Great Lakes. But in general, throughout the central, southeast part of the region, really struggling to even get to 50% of average for the month so far. So this is what's driving a lot of the impacts across the region, and agriculture, hydrology and water, and fire as well. And we'll get into some of those impacts in a little bit. But certainly October has been really much drier than average. One of the ways that we can look at the moisture in addition to precipitation is soil moisture. And so this is from the Climate Prediction Center, and looking at percentile. So basically comparing for this time of year, how dry are the soils? And you see, again, a lot of reds, oranges across the central region here, the north central states. And certainly remember, Nebraska was 10th driest for the growing season of April through September. That's showing up very clearly here. Kansas as well has struggled with dry conditions, and that's reflected in the soil moisture here for this week. Just to show a comparison of this year versus last year this time, where we had a little different climate going on a year ago this time, at least up here in the Dakotas, neighboring Minnesota. We were in a wetter pattern that held for much of the late fall, early winter season, and we were in recovery mode from the drought of the season of 2021. But if you look at the total change from a year ago this time to this week, NASA, their sport model for soil moisture, You see again the Dakotas, Minnesota, drier than last year this time, and a lot of red, pink to even that tan color. And this is on a percentage basis. So 20%, 15, 20 to 30% drier in some areas currently compared to a year ago. What's really concerning about the soil moisture situation currently is that fall is really an optimal season to recover soil moisture that's been used during the growing season to grow crops and grasses and yards and gardens and all that great stuff. And when we lose that opportunity to replenish our soil moisture through rainfall or precipitation in the fall, that tends to start us off in a tougher position in the winter or spring for the 2023 growing season. When our soils get cold or frozen, it tends to hold that moisture in, and that's typically a good indicator of where our starting point is going to be for 2023. Not to say we can't recover some though and get some improvement over the winter season, especially, and we'll look at the outlook here in a while as far as the moisture outlook for the seasonal outlook. Looking at drought, according to the U.S. Drought Monitor, and looking over the central region of the National Weather Service, so all these states here, from Montana to Ohio, over the region overall, we have nearly 60% of the region in drought, with about half of that, about 29%, in severe drought. That's D2 or worse. And so this is not a minor or moderate drought by any means. We're looking at some very severe to exceptional conditions, especially in the Missouri River Basin and part of the lower states as well, and the Kansas and so on that feed into the Mississippi. So what we see now on the drought monitor is that we see so much of the area in drought. That's what's affecting a lot of our river runoff and stream flow that we've been hearing so many impacts about especially in the lower Mississippi River. We've had and two, we've had this lingering drought, especially in the northwestern part of the region, the Missouri River Basin, on and off for about 2 years, and a little bit longer. So it's been a very long-term drought, even though it's ebbed and flowed, improved and worsened at times. We see really a widespread drought across the region. Here's looking at just recently at the drought monitor, looking at how many categories has the drought monitor changed just in the last 4 weeks. Keeping in mind that the drought monitor typically only changes no more than one category per week. So when you see some of these areas in the oranger colors that have degraded 3 categories in a 4-week period, that's a rapid intensification of drought in that area. And we see that all across the southern part of the region there, Missouri, Kentucky, Kansas, parts of southern Indiana, Illinois, and up in the north too, Iowa. Also in northwest Iowa, we've seen degradation of 3 categories in 4-week period. Granted, there are some areas of spotted improvement in the green colors on the west in Colorado and Wyoming, but overall we see a lot of intensifying and expanding drought conditions over the last month. Certainly there's been benefits as far as making harvest for corn and soybeans, those fall harvested crops, sunflower and so on, has helped, but it's also had downsides of almost too quickly drying down crops, and we're seeing some shattering of soybeans, for example, and some other impacts on the agriculture side. So just a couple of pictures of some impacts we've seen. First of all, just one of my pictures on the left of our very popular almost state holiday in South Dakota, pheasant opener, on Saturday, walking through a slough that would typically be maybe, knee-high or waist-high in water this time of year, and you can see how thick the vegetation would be, and this would typically be a very wet, swampy area at least, and it's just dry as a bone there. That's in northeastern South Dakota. Very popular recreational area in Minneapolis in the middle, on Minnehaha Creek and Minnehaha Falls nearby. You can see that bridge in the background. They're actually waterbed. That's now in D3 drought, I believe, in the Twin Cities area. And then on the right, of course, we've had some beautiful foliage all across the region. I've seen lots of pictures of this, and this is from Ohio, from our friend Aaron Wilson out there. So looking at the freeze, that's another hot topic, so to speak, in this time of year. And this is the date of the first 32-degree occurrence across the region, thanks to the Midwest Regional Climate Center for this information. So anything in the blue had their first 32-degree minimum temperature sometime in September. The green colors indicate the first 32-degree reading sometime in October. So you see the darker greens would be the first 10 days of the month. The medium green somewhere in the middle 10 days of the month, so the last 10 days. So we've seen frost pretty much all across the region, with some pockets here and there that still haven't gotten to 32 degrees. But remember, our minimum temperatures have been much colder than average, especially in the east. So this is a comparison here to show you how different we've been. This would be the median or the typical date that we'd expect a 32-degree frost. So typically in the north part of our region, we're not surprised by having a 32-degree minimum temperature sometime in September or early October. And then as you get further south, that tends to be later in the season, of course. But what's really interesting here is that we've also had our first hard frost or killing freeze at 28 degrees also across the region. So this has occurred a little bit earlier than typical, or a lot earlier than typical in some areas, but a little earlier than typical. So we've seen much of the central part of this region, at least from North Dakota to Wisconsin down to Kansas, Missouri, most of that area see their first killing frost already. And a lot of other areas I know have come very close. This would be the typical date that we'd see that first 28-degree reading. So especially in that Kansas, Missouri area, we did see that a couple weeks earlier than we typically do. And just to note too, not only have temperatures been below average, but we did see a number of record low temperatures just a couple days ago on October 18th. This is data from the Southeast Regional Climate Center, and everything you see, every station you see here with purple and then number 1 does show that was a record. The asterisk indicates that it had a tying ranking or tying record. And so you can see 1s, 3s, a lot of top 5 coldest record low temperatures across the region, from South Dakota all the way down to Missouri. So getting into some of the hydrology impacts and the water impacts that we've seen across the region, this is looking at the U.S. Geological Survey's stream flow data, their 28-day average. So look, essentially the last month, you see a lot of oranges, reds. The dark reds or the maroon color is the lowest 10th percentile, much below normal for this time of year. The oranges are in the 10 to 24th percentile, but I can tell you just by looking at it, they're on the lower end of that range for the most part. And so again, you can see kind of where all those rivers are flowing into the Mississippi eventually. That's contributing to the very low flows that we see across the lower Mississippi River basin.
And Laura, maybe just mention that often the last 28 days, if you average all that out, this is sort of the lowest time of year for many of the rivers and streams that we see on an average annual basis. So if we're below that even, we're really not seeing a lot of flows at all. And even in the green areas, that's 25 to 75%. So we could be on the less than 50% of normal flow, and it's that green area too. So just wanted to point that out.
Yeah, That's right. Yeah, this tends to be on the drier end or the lower stream flow season anyway, but this is even lower than typical. Yeah, thanks, Doug. So I would take a snapshot, a couple bites of information from some of the river basins here. So looking at the Missouri River in particular, the upper Missouri River that flows above into Sioux City, Iowa. So look at the main stem reservoir status. You see on the graph there the total system storage and all the reservoirs. The red line there showing where we are currently, much below average. That's the 1967 to 2020 average. Are these blue kind of stair steps through the middle? We're even lower than 2013, which is a previous dry year across the basin as well. You see the forecast and the gray dotted line to anticipate their system storage to go even lower before the end of the year. Current storage is about 48.5 million acre feet, about 2 million acre feet below this time last year. And the 2022 runoff forecast for the year total, about 76% of average. So a little, about 19.5 million acre feet total for the year, for the calendar year. But currently, looking at the drought monitor, over 90% of the basin is in abnormally dry or drought conditions. And they are adjusting releases at Gavin's Point, the last dam there in the upper basin, to be about 500 cubic feet per second above the minimum, and they're currently at about 32,000 cubic feet per second on their releases. So for those folks who are in the basin, they do have their fall public meetings planned for next week. And so if you're interested in that, check out their information at the Army Corps of Engineers for their schedule and locations. The Ohio River here too, been quite low with a modern record low level here at Cairo, Illinois. This is as of October 17th when this data was available. So at that point, it dipped down to 4.88 feet, breaking the record that was established in 1988. And we're hearing a lot of 1988s around the region with that severe drought year that affected the Midwest. And we're seeing a lot of these river gauges get below those elevations. Summarizing a few historical low water events here in the lower Ohio River and the lower Mississippi River. This is from the lower Mississippi River Forecast Center with NOAA. And you can see a few. So I just showed you Cairo. That's the top line there from the Ohio River. Also then Memphis and downstream all the way to Louisiana. Those asterisks indicate locations that have preliminarily at least broken their modern day low water records. You can see that where the current stages and their forecast lowest stage, even comparing the drought year of 2012 and 2000 and 1988 in comparison. So really we're seeing near record flows, and the news has been very very helpful in telling us what these impacts are in barges and moving agriculture and other commodities up and down through the rivers. And I think Brad might touch on some of that. So just some highlights or lowlights, however you want to look at it, as far as impacts. Kansas, Indiana, and I'm sure elsewhere are planting winter wheat and cover crops into dry soils, hoping to catch a rain to get some good germination and emergence. In Kansas, also seeing an unusual impact in some soil contraction and water main breaks due to that soil contraction, due to the very dry conditions. Overall, all across the region, we're seeing slow emergence of winter wheat due to dry soils. A lot of fires, as I mentioned, both due to harvest activities, vehicles, and fires in the field, but also just dry vegetation around, even in grass or natural areas too. Very dry and dry conditions for this harvest. Again, as is providing opportunity for rapid progress as far as harvest goes, but grain is very dry and at risk of shattering, as we've heard already some reports of that. Burn bans in effect in a lot of areas, of course, with the dry and some warm and windy conditions. I know in South Dakota last week, a couple days of harvest activities were put on hold in a lot of areas due to high wind, high fire danger. Some late planted crops, especially in the eastern part of the region, may have been affected by the early, very cold temperatures. Um, kind of too early to tell on some of those areas, but some of those fields were quite green um, when those cold temperatures came. In the Ohio River, a comment from there was that it was actually above normal until about mid-September, and then it's really dropped off since then and now below average. So this is really showing the recent acceleration of drought conditions and dry conditions. Some changes in the Mississippi River channel have led to, some of these preliminary record low elevations or on the rivers, and so they're still looking at that data. So that's why you see some of those preliminaries being stated. Um, and again, there's adaptations being done all up and down the river system from north to south. So looking ahead towards the winter, we'll start out with the first near term 7 days to 14 days, and then go out from there and look into the winter. There's been certainly some exceptional sunsets across the region. First of all, looking at some fire weather. This is just a snapshot from just a little while ago from the National Weather Service. All those pink areas, red flag or high fire danger, high fire risk. And we're seeing some very dry fuels, some very dry air, um, which has also been quite unusual for this time of year as well. So a lot of factors contributing to fire danger that are both climate and weather related, with winds, dry air, dry soils, and dry vegetation. Look at the next 7 days for the total precipitation forecast, looking at really just one model, one way to look at this. Still looking at relatively dry conditions from middle South Dakota down to Kansas. Um, the best chance for precipitation, it looks like, will be Sunday to Monday in the coming week. And still, though, you're looking at those blue colors with an optimistic rainfall of half an inch to an inch, something like that. So probably not a lot, not enough to really significantly raise our stream flows, our rivers and creeks and streams across the region, but could help those fall planted crops like winter wheat and cover crops across the area. They have moisture to get started this time of year. Looking at 8 to 14 days out, so this would be the end of October, early November. Generally looking at temperatures leaning towards warmer than average in the north central states from North Dakota, Minnesota down to Kansas. And generally slightly leaning towards warmer over much of the region in those orange colors. That would be the map on the left. Map on the right there, also odds slightly leaning toward higher than average in that same time period, 8 to 14 days from now, with kind of higher probabilities there over western North Dakota in our region. Near normal chances of above, below, or near average precipitation in those areas in the gray, which would be most of the eastern part of our region. And here, looking at November, the month ahead here, generally here, equal chances. You see a lot of equal chances here over the north part of the region as far as temperature goes. So no clear consensus on temperature being warmer, cooler, or near average for the month of November. But generally in the southwestern portion of the country, temperatures leaning towards warmer than average for that month. On precipitation side, we see generally favoring dry conditions across the south and leaning towards wetter conditions in the northern Pacific Northwest, um, with most of our region somewhere in the middle. Again, equal chances of drier, wetter, or near average precipitation for the month of November. Kind of what's driving a lot of this is looking at La Nina, 75% chance of continuing through the winter season of December through February. This is our third La Nina winter in a row, and better than half probability that will transition into neutral or out of La Nina conditions in the late winter, early spring of next year. Looking at historically La Nina impacts across the region, generally doesn't tell us a whole lot here on the left map. In the beige areas, doesn't tell us a lot on precipitation in the northern states, but does lean towards wetter in the southern, more Midwestern region, in the Great Lakes region, but also leans towards colder, particularly in the late winter around the month of February across much of the northern and central part of our region. So um, that is what we historically see with La Nina. And the official winter outlook came out this morning from NOAA, and so I'll show these maps and the next series of maps to help illustrate that. Again, leaning pretty heavy on a pretty typical La Nina pattern here across the region and the country in general. November through January, looking at those 3 months overall, generally favoring warmer than average temperatures and all across the south, especially the southwest and up along the eastern seaboard, with most of our region here on the central region with a little less certainty on temperature. Precipitation here on the right, again, very kind of typical La Nina pattern with favoring wetter conditions in the northern Rockies and Pacific Northwest and drier favored along the southern. As we look out ahead, kind of leapfrog a little bit. So this is January through March. So looking at the late winter, January through March, that 3 month period, this is where you start to see those colder than average temperatures coming in on the northern part of our region, and the area favored to be warmer, getting a little more restricted down to the southern states. Again, this is kind of where we see more of the La Nina impact, and this month CPC is kind of filtering that area favored to be cooler than average, a little further south than they had last month. On the precipitation side, there again, looking January through March, you see the Great Lakes region, as is typical in a late winter La Nina pattern, favored to be wetter than average. So this is where we could see some drought improvement in the winter season and early spring. Also favored to be above average in the northern Rockies. So kind of swinging from west to east a little bit, and also drier in the southern states. That includes southern Colorado, Kansas, in our region. So a lot of the central region here, though, is in between with equal chances of wetter, drier, or near average for that 3 month period of late winter. So just some key messages, that we're seeing 3 of our major rivers that drain the central part of the country all experiencing drought at the same time. It's very unusual to see that with really extremely low river levels as a result for this time of year. Not seeing any substantial precipitation, at least in the near future, to rise those levels. We do see a little bit of concern on the cold temperature outlook. Depending how much we get for snow cover to insulate the ground, we could see some deeper than usual frost depths with some colder temperatures in the long range outlook. That could have some impacts. When we talk about pipes and other infrastructure that's buried, that could be affected by deeper frost depths. So that's something to keep an eye out deeper into the winter. And by all accounts, drought has intensified and expanded the last 30 days and generally expected to persist with an uncertain temperature and precipitation forecast, at least in the next 30 days, 30 or through the month of November. We don't really see any elevated chance of precipitation until later in the winter. And then, as we've mentioned before, La Nina now in the third year in a row, and has often pointed to a colder late wind and wetter over the Great Lakes. So I tried to talk as fast as I could there, but hopefully I left enough time for Brad to go next on the webinar. So thank you for listening.
Thank you, Laura. I'm going to shift quickly to Brad, hopefully. And like I said, hopefully, Brad, you're seeing the thing. We will sort of cover the climate and crop angle in terms of 2022 from USDA and agriculture's point of view, and what's happening here, Brad.
All right. Can you see the screen and can you hear me?
Nope. And yes. I can
All
hear.
right. You can hear, that's good. Well, I did the share screen and I switched it to full screen mode. So we just got to figure this out real quick. What's going on here with that?
All right. Sometimes it does take a second. Let me pull it back.
All right.
Let me pull it back. And
I think we had this trouble when we were warming up here. So hopefully it'll work a second time like it did before.
Yeah. So go ahead and shut your presentation down, and then I'll share it with you, and then pull it back up. So we're going to look at your beautiful blue screen.
All right.
Yeah. Yeah. We see your beautiful screen.
All right.
You're trying to, yep. Uh-huh.
All right. We're getting there. We're getting there.
We see the river. That's the Mississippi River for those who.
All right. I just need to switch to spot preventer. Okay. There we go. Are we good?
We're good. Take it away.
All right. Thank you. Sorry about that. And we will roll. With the talk about the low river levels, I thought, and the importance to agriculture, shipping the grains and oil seeds down the river this time of year. I just wanted to start. This was a flyover that I did from 35,000 feet about 2 weeks ago, across the Mississippi, looking south here, just south of St. Louis. And it was really striking how small the river was, how many sandbars were showing. And then if you look real closely, how many barges are stacked up there south of St. Louis. This was about the time we were hearing about more than 100 barges being backed up just south of here at Memphis on down into Mississippi. So with that said, a couple of highlights related to the low river levels and barge movements. Well, we've already seen low water records from August of 2012 being broken in Missouri locations like New Madrid and Caruthersville. Records from July 88 have been set in Osceola, Arkansas, Memphis, Tennessee, and then Greenville, Mississippi broke a low water record from January of 64. I do want to point out, people wondering how long these low river levels are going to last. If you look at Memphis specifically, we've got records back about 70 years. Twice we have seen those low levels more than -5 feet for a gauge reading into February. That happened in 1977 and 2003, just for the record. And you're wondering, how can we have low river levels so late? Well, think about how cold those two winters were, 76, 77, 2002, 2003. So getting back to what Laura was talking about, if we get into a cold pattern, we can lock up even more of that water into ice in the upper reaches of these river basins, especially the Mississippi and Missouri. That could complicate the issue. So something we really need to look forward to, something we may be talking about next month and beyond if we don't get substantial rainfall before we get into the cold season.
Hey,
anyway, low water. Yeah.
Yeah. Any chance to minimize or move that little menu off of your screen to some degree?
Yeah, let me just get rid of it.
And while you say that, Brad, it's really important that people realize that the depth, I'll call it the depth of drought, that we're in. And I think you're trying to get to that, and you're doing a good job. And I'm not complaining, but if a lot of this river turns to ice, as Brad was saying, it's going to lock up a lot of water, slow the water down, not allow as much water to come through. So that and replenishing the soils after it freezes, I think Laura touched on that. It's harder to do, harder to get the water down into the soil column, as we call it. I'm sorry. Go ahead, Brad.
No, that's fine. It's just something we're going to be dealing with, I think, for a while. You know, we're later in the year for these minima than in 88 or 2012, but we have seen precedent where we've had low water levels on into and through the winter. All right, anyway, about 60% of all U.S. grain shipped heads through the port of New Orleans. So it's a pretty important waterway. And so when you can't ship it down the river, you've got to move it onto trucks or trains. So there's added complications there. Right now, according to spokespersons from industry sources, barge volume on the waterway is about 45% lower than normal because you can't load the boats as full as normal. They drag the box. A barge can carry about the equivalent of 70 trucks worth of cargo. So almost 1 million bushels of grain per barge. So it's really critical, and it's something, again, I think we'll be talking about probably next month and maybe beyond. All right, moving along to getting into some of these agricultural things after one more look at Memphis. We have set the record, broke the July of 88 record about 3 days ago. Just to put it in perspective, it's almost 60 feet lower than the water level during the May 2011 flood. Something to think about there. All right, looking at some of the ag highlights for 2022. It's a long time ago, but we did have some really slow spring planting in parts of this region, especially as you move into, say, eastern North Dakota. There were some other pockets of wetness complicating the planting picture. A pretty slow progress for corn and soybeans. As the growing season went along, we actually had minimal heat stress east of the Mississippi River, but we had some very hot weather as you move to the western part of the region. That heat and the drought really cut crop prospect potential in states like Kansas, Missouri, Nebraska, South Dakota. It's only the second time in the last 7 years that U.S. corn production was less than 14 billion bushels. Major impacts were on crops primarily grown in the plains, including sorghum. And then getting into the guts of it for farmers, commodity prices came up over a year ago, factors ranging from weather to war. But at the same time, input costs, just like everything else right now, has become more expensive. That includes fuel, fertilizer, and so these numbers are backed off a little bit. Still very high input costs for farming right now. Just a quick look at the current vegetation health. You have to look at this in context. Time of year means a lot, but I will say that the stress that's showing up in some of the western areas, say Montana, down through Kansas and Colorado, that's reflective of very poor rangeland and pasture conditions, as well as poor emergence for winter grains and cover crops. So again, the footprint of drought shows up in just about everything. This is for the continental United States, is specific to this region, not specific to the National Weather Service Central region. Just want to point out 108 weeks that the continental US has had more than 40% drought coverage, far exceeding what we saw in 2012, 2013, 68 weeks, or 2002 and 2003. So by far, if you look at the whole picture, the worst drought of the 21st century based on US Drought Monitor statistics. Topsoil moisture from USDA NASS, a weekly product during the growing season, really shows that expanse of the dryness. Very short to short rate, 65%. That's way above last year at this time when we were at 37%. And look at those numbers from some of the western states there. Kansas, 88% very short to short, also at or above 80% in Nebraska and South Dakota, with that dryness creeping eastward now, even in as far east as Kentucky at 77% very short to short. If you look at that in graphical form, this has only been a national product since 2015, so a short period of record. But in that short period of record, we are now at a record level, 65% very short to short, exceeding anything we saw or in 2020 or at any other time since the mid-2010s. And that dry spell the last, say, 4 to 6 weeks is really showing up in the database there. Just wanted to show real quick, I showed this last year and probably the previous year before that. Risk Management Agency of the USDA with crop indemnity payouts. And you can see some of the planting problems early in the season. Look at southeastern North Dakota, northeastern South Dakota. Well, they're dry now, but it was wet earlier, hard to believe. You can see that once you get from the Mississippi Valley eastward, things not, your payouts there are less than $1 million. But we do have some serious issues in the West. Some of the parts of Montana never recovered from last year's drought. Drought returned in parts of the Dakotas. Drought's been really a strong imprint this year as you move down into Kansas, Nebraska, and eastern Colorado. All right, I'm going to go through a bunch of crops. I'm only going to explain this once, just to keep it short. Green, dark green, light green, major and minor production areas in the U.S. The yellow numbers is the percentage of the production accounted for by that state based on 2017 census data. So there's your corn belt. Here is the expected yield for 2022, 171.9 bushels per acre. That's a down year. Even with that down year, we are seeing potential record corn yields in Illinois and Wisconsin. That also shows up on this map with the hash beside the number, Illinois, Wisconsin. But for the most part, outside of the drought areas, North Dakota, Minnesota, where it was a recovery year from last year, corn yields are down and way down in some of the western and southern parts of this region. That Kentucky number, you're wondering why that's so bad. That was because of a heat wave in June that just happened to hit right as corn was pollinating. It's the same thing that happened throughout the Southeast, very untimely heat. So that knocked the Kentucky corn yield way down compared to last year. Now, we did see the lowest corn production since the flood year of 2019, only the second time in the last 7 years with corn production below 14 billion bushels. Corn conditions, you can see that east-west divide there. Things look pretty good as you get to the Mississippi River and eastward, and looking pretty rough. South Dakota, Kansas, Nebraska, and Colorado, with less than 40% of the crop rated good to excellent in the last report of the season on October 16th. Nationally, 53%, 7 points below this time a year ago. On the flip side, very poor to poor, corn rated at least 1/3 to more than a half, very poor to poor in Nebraska, Colorado, and Kansas versus 21% nationally, 7 points above this time a year ago. Corn harvest is progressing very nicely, especially in those drier western areas where there's less grain to harvest. Things go quickly. So harvest is well ahead of average nationally and even further ahead of average as you move into states like South Dakota and Nebraska. For soybeans, there's your production areas, and there is your yield, a down year also at 49.8 bushels per acre. No states in this region having a potential soybean yield record this year. That said, there was recovery from last year in North Dakota and Minnesota. All other states in the region down from last year, way down, 30% from last year for the yield in Kansas, 22% in Nebraska. Soybean acreage was very high this year, so the overall effect on production is a little bit less. It could have been a monster year for soybeans if it had been a good year. As it is, it's down slightly from last year. Soybean conditions, we don't have a comparison to last year. Too much of the crop had been harvested. But again, you can see the impact on soybean conditions in South Dakota, Nebraska, and Kansas. Same thing in the very poor to poor ratings. At least a quarter of the crop rated very poor to poor in South Dakota, Nebraska, and Kansas. You hear those states being repeated a lot in terms of the drought impact on 2022 crops. Soybean harvest even quicker than corn. That's not unusual in a year like this where it's dry. Producers love to get the soybeans out quickly because they're a little bit more vulnerable to adverse weather. So if you can get them out when it's late. And as Laura said, we have had reports of too fast of a dry down and some pod shattering and lower test weights coming out just because things are drying down so quickly as this dry spell continues across much of the Midwest. Sorghum, this is a crop that's really been hammered. Almost more than half of the production typically comes out of Kansas. And for this year, if you look at the very poor to poor ratings, almost half the U.S. crop rated very poor to poor. When you get your number one state, 54% very poor to poor, that is not a good sign. Just ravaged the entire crop from South to Texas by heat and drought. This is already past the halfway mark, so obviously no hope of recovery at this point. And just touching on a few other crops, spring wheat. Now, there is some good news. Spring wheat, durum wheat, and sunflowers all up sharply over last year because it was the big drought in the north last year. Northern Plains drought, upper Midwestern drought. So things really recovered. It wasn't an optimal crop, but it was far better than 2021. And so we see the numbers for spring wheat. Production up 46% over last year's crop. Durum wheat up 70% for production. And sunflower production was up 53%, partly on an increase in acreage because people just didn't plant last year. It was just too darn dry. Now, the bad news is sugar beets, which mostly grown in the Red River Valley. We did see some very late planting, and so that took some of the yield potential down there. So we did see production down 10%, yield down 13% for sugar beets. Winter wheat was definitely hurt by drought. I'll have more on that in a little bit. And then this is kind of a big story too for livestock producers. Hay production, 2021 was not a very good year, and 2022 was worse. Ongoing drought, third year of drought in parts of the western and central U.S., cutting U.S. hay production by 11% compared to last year. The yield fell by 1/8 or 12.5%. Real quick on those crops, spring wheat, you can see where most of it's grown, Northern Plains. It was an up year, but not a great year. I mean, anything's better than 2021 when you look at the numbers there on the graph. And then if you look at the comparison to last year, we actually a potential record yield from North Dakota, 50 bushels per acre, up 49% from last year. And so a big change, certainly a better year, although not perfect. Durum wheat, almost all grown in Montana and North Dakota. Again, they were hit by the drought of 2017, hit by the drought of 2021, a recovery year in 2022. And you can see that Montana, incredible, 75% above on almost zeroed out crop in 2021. For sunflowers, almost all the crop comes out of the Dakotas. Harvest is in progress, about a quarter complete, almost a quarter complete by October 16th. Then sugar beets, more than half the U.S. crop comes down to the Red River Valley and environs there in North Dakota and Minnesota. An off year with the really late planting, but with the dry weather, half of the crop in Minnesota was harvested just in the last week to reach 82% harvested and ahead of schedule. So you would have never believed that when we saw the record late planting this spring for sugar beets. Just shortened the season down and not optimal sugar production. Winter wheat, this is the big current story in terms of crops. Most of the acreage in the southern part of the region, Kansas, the #1 production state in the U.S., a quarter typically of the production. And last year, it was an off year, 47 bushels an acre. Third straight year, we've seen a winter wheat yield decline. And then, so the numbers were really off from Wyoming and Nebraska southward. Got hit hard by the developing drought across the central and southern Great Plains. Meanwhile, they had a good year in the north and even a record yield for the 2022 harvested crop in North Dakota, 81%, 82% above last year. Now, the current crop, the one going in the ground now that will be harvested in 2023, it's interesting, as dry as it's been, some of these planting numbers are behind schedule. And you're thinking, why? Well, it's because some folks are just not wanting to take a chance on dusting in the crop. They're waiting for the forecast of rain. That's true probably in Illinois, Indiana, parts of Kansas. And so you see folks just holding out hope for some moisture to get this crop going. The further north you are, the more you're going to run out of time. It just gets too cold. You need 40-degree average temperatures to germinate and grow a wheat crop. So it's running late. That's why they went ahead and threw it in the ground in Montana and South Dakota. But anyway, that, planting on schedule, but a little behind in some spots. This is a warning flag. Look at all those colors on the brown and reddish side there. Wheat is not emerging properly. You're at least 10 percentage points behind your average emergence pace in South Dakota, in Kansas, Illinois, Indiana, Ohio. That's a warning flag that the crop's not emerging evenly or becoming established properly with the dry conditions. It all needs rain right now. Currently, 70% of the U.S. winter wheat production area is experiencing drought. And that number has gone up sharply from just a few weeks ago, from 53% and an earlier reading in the mid-40s back in June and July. This time a year ago, 41% was in drought, but it got hurt as drought continued to come on and get worse through the late winter and spring, and just very untimely drought intensification. So we'll have to see what happens this year. Maybe things will still turn around, but anyway, all production areas desperately need rain for winter wheat. And finally, rangeland and pasture conditions. Less than a quarter of the U.S. rangeland and pastures are currently rated good to excellent. Most of those are in the eastern third of the U.S. There are some good pastures in states like Wisconsin, Ohio, but not so much as you move to the west. On the flip side, very poor to poor ratings. Nationally, 48%, led by Nebraska, 83% very poor to poor. That is more than 50 percentage points higher than this time a year ago. Because it's so late in the year, even if we get rain or snow now, we're probably not going to get much regrowth of grass. We'll have to wait until at least spring before the grass regrows, especially in the northern areas. And so that will be an ongoing problem where you have to bring in feed for livestock all the way through the winter. Rangeland and pasture conditions have been pretty low for 3 years in a row, 2020, 2021, 2022, all on that lower tier of years, kind of rivaling the 2011, 2012, early 2013 cycle when we had the multi-year drought there. And just finally, just finish up, I showed this last year when fertilizer prices were a big story. Thought I'd just continue it another year. These are input costs for producers. 17% increase on feed prices from August 2021, a little over a year ago. And then fertilizer prices, although down 5%, are still up 27% from August 2021. So just like every other sector in America, agriculture, things are expensive, and it's even outstripping the inflation numbers right now for some of these input costs. With that, I think we're right at 3 o'clock or 2 o'clock Central, and I'll turn it back over to you, Doug.
Thanks, Brad. That was a great,
Thank you.
Great summary from you and Laura. Every year it's good. Last year wasn't so bad. This year, sorry about all the negative information. But you know what? That's why we're here to get people to pay attention and hopefully, right, prepare as best they can for what may be coming in the future. So anyway, it's 2 o'clock. I want to make sure we get to your questions, so stay tuned if you want to hear that. A little bit about the La Nina and such, Brad and Laura, and I don't know if Dennis joined us yet. Let's see. Nope. So we don't have our usual Dennis Toddy from USDA Climate Hub on Midwest Climate Hub, but we have Brad and Laura. Both of them are sort of, if you will, experts in the ag side of the house. We have a number of questions that are really good. It's true, the third La Nina in a row. That's not necessarily good news. The good news about La Ninas is that they're relatively unpredictable. So we have general patterns on what could happen. So far, this sort of a dry fall is not, unfortunately, that unusual for for a number of La Nina years. So I hate to say warm and dry isn't unusual, but it isn't. And when it flips to cold, don't know when that's going to happen. We did see some evidence from Laura that we're going to get some moisture over portions of the Midwest and plains in the next week or so. But what we really, really, really need is a sustained, constant barrage, if you will, of rain to make up for the deficits. Get the streams flowing again, because one rain a month isn't going to do that, or one snow. In fact, snow is not going to help a lot until it actually melts, and it has to be a lot of snow to do a lot of good. So anyway, let me go to the questions. We have, okay, the first question is, how are low water levels and waterways impacting water quality and water availability for community on that are reliant on surface water, basically? And I don't know if we've heard the reports, Laura and Brad, on water quality yet. I know we've had some water availability issues here and there, or people getting close to having issues. I think that was Southern Illinois, or is it Southern Indiana? Which one did we hear that from? Do you remember? Either one of you?
No, I don't remember. Sorry.
Okay.
Well, yeah, Doug, you're right. On the water quality side, I haven't heard much And on the water supply side, good news is we're at the end of the growing season. You know, people aren't watering their lawns. We don't need water for irrigation, for agriculture. You know, it's generally a lower time of year as far as water use goes. So that's the good news. Do know, you know, there are some water intakes, you know, that are now exposed, and some communities are going to their backup water source, whether it be wells or what have you. So I know there is some of that going on, but I don't know any more specifics beyond that.
Okay, and so what Laura was referring to about water intakes, there are some issues with that and ice sometimes, and low flows during the winter time where ice can build up and expose water intakes and such out of some of the major rivers, and any rivers for that matter. Normally this time of year, we had one state climatologist out of Minnesota mentioned that normally this time of year, when you look at stream flow, you actually see a little bit of a rebound because, as Laura said, irrigation is slowing down. People are using less water generally, but we're not seeing that rebound in a number of the streams that we normally would. There was a question down below about potential for fish kills with low water. So I'll cover that now because it's similar. In the Missouri River and icing. And yeah, one thing I don't think you mentioned it, Laura, but the Corps will go down to 12,000 CFS. I don't know the date. If someone from the Corps wants to mention if someone from the Corps wants to mention what that was, I think it was December 1st. The idea was to bump down to 12,000 cubic feet per second out of Gavin's Point Dam, which would be quite a bit less than what they're releasing at the moment, because it's for navigation at the moment. And when they don't have to do navigation, then they're able to reduce flows. Anyway, if it gets terribly cold, that'll build up ice, and there are some issues downstream from Sioux City, basically, that with water intakes and such. I don't know what the impact, or we don't know the impact on fish, but you can imagine if it gets cold and there's shallow water, there will be some impacts. Okay, Laura, answer this question. When does winter wheat require moisture after planting? And Brad, you certainly could chime in.
Yeah, I think any time after it's planted, as soon as the day it's planted, you know. But I had heard reports from Ohio that there's some seed in the ground that's been sitting in the soil for 2 weeks or more now at this point. So the longer it sits in the soil without, you know, emerging or germinating or emerging, the more susceptible it is to the temperature extremes in particular, especially with these very cold temperatures we're seeing that could get in. Although, you know, winter wheat does not need a lot of moisture to get started. You know, my colleagues at SDSU Extension have told me, you know, really if it just gets enough moisture to swell the seed, it doesn't even have to emerge, and it can still vernalize or survive the winter pretty well, even without emerging. But it does need some moisture to get through the cold season. That's what I know. I'll hand it off to Brad if he knows any more.
Yeah, Brad, anything to add to that?
Yeah, people forget how important spring weather is for winter wheat, and there are actually rare cases where the crop may not emerge until it gets spring moisture. Usually the outcome's not very good, but it just kind of shows you how hardy and how tough winter wheat really can be. So that said, you really prefer to have a well-established winter wheat crop in the fall. And maybe this rain coming up here on the 23rd to 25th will help the situation, especially across the north and maybe into the mid-south where the frontal tail is going to be active. I think
go ahead.
There's still some hope. I don't want to write this crop. Every time you write off a winter wheat crop, it's got another life. It's got 9 lives.
Thanks, Brad. Golly, there was something out of Kansas I'm trying to remember in terms of wheat. We heard from some of the specialists there. As long as it stays dry, the wheat kernel is fine. But if it gets wet and then dries out, it's not good. Wasn't that something that they mentioned as well?
Heard that yesterday in the call.
Yeah. Okay. Cairo in Illinois temporarily switched water supply to groundwater. Okay, that's from the Illinois State climatologist. For those interested in water supply and such, so communities, municipalities are starting because they're running out of water, I suppose, or trying to balance their water supply, are starting to look at other options. Cooler weather goes a long way to helping water quality issues. It certainly does. And we should also mention water quality issues, Laura, especially in South Dakota, in terms of livestock or other states around you. That was an issue this summer in terms of water quality and quantity. Anything you want to mention going into the fall?
Yeah, you're right. I neglected to mention that. I was thinking of water quality for humans when that question came up earlier. But yeah, when you have low water, that tends to concentrate the salts in those stock ponds for that surface water for livestock. And so, yeah, that is an issue that we've been dealing with every drought. That's a common issue. We do a lot of water testing, with SDSU Extension, same in North Dakota as well. So yeah, that's an ongoing issue, I would say, and water availability for livestock too. A lot of those more arid areas in the western part of the Dakotas don't have as much water infrastructure around, so they have to truck it in or somehow bring water to animals when they're out in pasture.
Thank you. Just a sort of an analog question here. So from the private sector, they have a list of. Do we have a list of analog years in which La Niña shifts in the spring to springtime and the U.S. summer? To neutral. Okay, to a neutral condition. And I imagine that is almost every non-multi-year La Niña. It usually moves for some period of time into neutral. I'm not sure we have analogs for that. And Brad, basically, and Laura too, but basically La Nina is a little bit like neutral, but a little more with steroids. So there's often you don't see big differences between a neutral year and La Nina, but sometimes you do. Analog years are really tough to base anything on. I don't know. Brad, you want to say, or Laura, anything you want to say about La Nina shifting what we could expect for next spring, summer if we go to neutral? What would that mean? I think that's kind of what we're after here.
The only thing I would say is that there is sometimes a lag effect on average, and I'll bring up the example of the triple dip La Nina of 98 to 2001. We actually saw U.S. drought coverage peaking after the event ended, the 3-year event ended in 2002 and into early 2003. So I think there's still some drought risk looking forward. That's just kind of, it's a very small data set when you're looking at triple dip La Niñas, so it's a little tough to try to figure out how we're going to play out. But I would say drought risk is still a concern heading forward into next year.
And then what were the 2 years since 1950? There were only 2 3-year events. And one of them was, what did you say, 98 to 2001 or something? And then what was the other?
Yeah, and the other one was 73, 74 through 75, 76.
Okay.
Maybe coincidence, but remember the Great Western Drought of 76, 77 actually followed that triple dip.
Don't say that. Okay.
But again, it's a really small data set, and there was some other things going on back in the 70s. So I'll just leave it at that.
So I would say,
don't take that as a forecast.
Yeah, right. Yeah, right. And there's certainly no statistical with 2 events in 70 years. We have no statistical backup behind us on this. All right. And yeah, there's a bunch of questions kind of, do we have a list of analog years in which we have had 3 La Nina events end in the spring and summer's neutral? And I think we've answered that. Yeah. And yeah, acknowledging that's very rare. And so I would say no, Kevin, we don't. But one could go back online and look at those years, I think, in terms of precipitation patterns and such, and and draw their own conclusions in terms of analog. But I'd be very, very, I'd caveat that heavily on using that to make any kind of prediction, for sure.
Yeah, Doug, just to piggyback onto that, I might add, I say this to a lot of folks, kind of like investments. Past performance is not an indicator of future performance. And, like I'm looking at Eastern Dakotas, for example, the parts of that territory have gotten 20% wetter in like the last 50 years.
Yeah.
So looking at similar years, really far back, maybe aren't the best comparison in this rare case of triple dip La Nina.
I agree.
I hate to do this, but I'm going to do it because, Laura, I know what's in your slideshow and I know what you didn't show. So, Laura, would you mind bringing your slideshow back up and show the different La Nina outcomes over the years? Because I know you can do it. And you hit it because we don't have time to talk about it. And we're going to probably talk about this a little bit more. Start with, do temperature and then show... then we can show precipitation. But what Laura's going to show you is, well, I don't know the last year you got on here, but anyway, this is what's happened in the past. Again, this is very focused on December, January, and February. So we're missing, either side of that, right? So this is the core of the winter. And where you see blue, that's cooler than normal. Where you see orange or red, that's warmer than normal. And you can see, and I think this is a range. Is this a range from strong to weak? What is this a range from? Yeah. So the stronger.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, the stronger events are on top. The weaker events are on the bottom. And some people would say it doesn't matter too much. Some would say it matters a lot. So anyway, you can see these different La Nina winters over the years, and you can see that it's not consistent. The one thing we have seen somewhat regularly, though, is this cool signature across the northern part of the U.S. Okay, yep, we can have a warm signature too, definitely, but the tendency is to be cooler than normal, especially across the northwest into the central, north central part of the U.S. Now you can show precipitation, if you will. And this one is harder to see. You got to look very closely, but green, of course, is wetter. Brown is drier. And if you look across the north central part of the U.S., really, Ohio Valley is pretty, somewhere around the Ohio Valley into the Great Lakes often are wet. But I'd say it's pretty darn inconclusive once you get west of the Rockies, or east of the Rockies in Montana. Really, it's a tough call when it comes to precipitation. Again, we're only talking about December, January, and February here. So it would be nice to do this for, let's say, February, March, and April, or something like that, to look into the spring a little bit. Anyway, I think that's all the questions that we have for the day. Thank you, Laura. That was great. I want to say thank you to everybody who's on the call. One thing we didn't hit too hard were wildfires. There is a higher than normal probability for fires, especially during harvest season, across most of the central part of the U.S. due to just dry conditions, and we call them harvest fires or combine fires or whatever you want to call them. Also with some high winds that are going to be coming in with the next storm system. We're usually preceding that. Actually preceding it after, if it's a dry front, you can see fires. Pretty common until we get some snowfall or decent precipitation. So fire season is going to extend for a while. So be aware of that as well. Anything else, Laura and Brad? I'll finish. I'm stopping. Anything else?
No, I don't have anything to add.
That's all for me.
Thank you too very, very much. We'll see you next year. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.